desde sus antecedentes principales, tanto académicos como científicos, como de gestor de políticas internacionales, porque si leemos su currículum completo corremos el riesgo de acabarnos la hora. El doctor Ritchie es profesor investigador de la Universidad de Ottawa, Canadá. Es experto en formación de psicólogos, ética profesional y regulación del ejercicio profesional. Es uno de los representantes más significativos de la psicología en el sistema de Naciones Unidas, especialmente en la Organización Mundial de la Salud. En uno de sus más importantes proyectos, trabajan junto con el doctor Jeffrey Reed, que algunos de ustedes escucharon en el auditorio de la unidad de posgrado hablarnos sobre el ICD-11, y que, como ustedes saben, es la primera vez en la historia que un psicólogo realmente tiene el liderazgo del desarrollo del nuevo sistema clasificatorio de salud mental. Él y el doctor Ritchie están trabajando conjuntamente en este programa que todo parece indicar y todo va a indicar que es tendrá uno de los productos más importantes en varias décadas en los sistemas clasificatorios y en especial en el de salud mental. El doctor Ritchie ha sido integrante de consejos internacionales. Los dos más grandes consejos internacionales son el de Ciencias Sociales y el Internacional de Ciencias. Es integrante del Consejo Consultivo sobre proyectos interdisciplinarios de atención a la salud en problemas crónicos, editor asociado de la Revista Internacional de Psicología e integrante del Consejo Editorial de la Revista en Psicología Comunitaria. Secretario General de la Unión Internacional de Psicología Científica durante muchos años, que como algunos de ustedes saben, se le considera a esta unión como las Naciones Unidas de la Psicología. Está conformada por los presidentes de las sociedades nacionales de psicología de todo el mundo. Integrante del Comité de Examinación sobre Jurisprudencia y Ética del Colegio de Psicólogos de Ontario. Integrante del Comité de Formación del Colegio de Psicólogos de Quebec. Integrante del Comité de Ética de la Asociación Canadiense de Psicología. Organizador de muy numerosos eventos, simposia, conferencias magistrales, congresos, reuniones científicas, reuniones profesionales, de los más importantes congresos canadienses e internacionales de psicología. Es autor de numerosos artículos, capítulos y libros sobre ética y ejercicio profesional del psicólogo. Es integrante del Comité de la Organización Mundial de la Salud sobre el desarrollo de la clasificación internacional de enfermedades, como decíamos hace un momento, especialmente en salud mental. Representante en varias funciones de Canadá en las conversaciones trilaterales sobre formación y ejercicio profesional del psicólogo Canadá, Estados Unidos y México, que iniciaron en 1984 y se prolongaron por 12 años. Debo decir que fue durante el trabajo de esta comisión, uno de los pocos representantes nacionales que no tuvo una actitud proteccionista cuando se hablaba de la movilidad de profesionales de la psicología, y es algo que para que se conocieran los sistemas de formación, de ética y de regulación profesional del psicólogo, fue fundamental su actitud para que esto fuera muy bien conocido, sobre todo en Estados Unidos y en Canadá. Y lo mejor de todo, que es lo que siempre uno disfruta más, es un amigo muy querido de muchos años. Es una persona que acude a los llamados tanto institucionales como personales cuando hace falta hacer algo en psicología. Una persona que con una gran facilidad y una gran fluidez tiene la posibilidad de incidir tanto sobre políticas generales como cambiar la opinión de algo o de alguien si las cosas no se ven muy bien. De modo quiero que me ayuden a darle la bienvenida al doctor profesor Piere Ritchie.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. It's been too many years since I have been here in Mexico. There was a time when I would have been able at least to start in Spanish, although I would have had to then change to English or French. And I'm starting in English because I'm going to continue in English. Back where I'm come from, in Canada, particularly those of us who are French Canadians, we don't really like it when someone does one sentence in French and then talks for half an hour or an hour in English. So I'm not going to insult you. My Spanish, which was always un poco español, is even less. But I'm going to tell you one thing I was really proud of. Some years ago, many years ago, I did a week-long workshop here at UNAM for the Faculty of Psychology. In a large auditorium, we had about 250 people. It was on clinical supervision, and it was when you were trying to develop more in clinical supervision. And so it had simultaneous translation because it was a whole week, all day, every day for 5 days, except when Mexico was playing in World Cup soccer. And then we all had to go outside and see the big screen. And by the end of the week, I no longer needed the translator to understand what the colleagues from the audience were saying by questions or comments. I could understand it, but my expressive Spanish was still a very poco español. So with that, I'm just going to apologize for the fact that I have lost what Spanish I have, and I'm going to just continue in English. During the questions, though, or comments, I encourage you, if you prefer that, to ask your comments or to make your comments or ask your questions in Spanish, because whatever I don't pick up, and I did understand most of the introduction, it was quite positive, I must say. It always sounds better in another language, I think. But between Dr. Reed and Dr. Sanchez-Souza, I'm sure that we can cover off anything that you would want me to understand. So with that, as a little bit of an introduction of my own, let me say I'm really glad to be here. I always love coming to this country. For me, it's there are so many similarities between Canada and Mexico that most people don't understand. You know, if you're from other parts of the world, you just see Canada as an extension of the United States. They forget that Canada and Mexico bookend the United States, and they each have distinct cultural characteristics, which come in part for us, as for you, from a Latin tradition, and also from an indigenous tradition. And those are factors that unite us. Now, I always like to start a talk by saying where we're going to go today. So my job, as I understand it, is to talk about education and training from an international perspective, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So the first little bit will just be to set the stage. That's where we're going to go. But then I'm going to do something that most people would have put down here, but I'm going to put right up number 2, and that is to talk to you about the Canadian context, not because I'm trying to promote the Canadian context, but because I want to inform you of what my biases are. What is the culture out of which I come around these issues? And I think you need to know that to understand what I'm going to say about the rest. And you can be listening for where my biases creep in, and maybe you want to critique that later. Then we're going to move to the international context. We'll talk about the IUCIS survey, making sense of globalization, and then the international project on competency. You're going to hear that competency is something I'm going to stress, and that comes out also in terms of the EuroSci. And then I have a few concluding observations. Because we are working essentially in 3 languages, you need to remember part of my head is working in French, your heads are working mainly in Spanish, and we're all talking in, or at least I'm talking in English. So if there's something that just isn't making sense, it's not comprehensible, ask me to clarify it right then. But if it's a real question or you want a discussion, then we save that till after it's over. But I don't want you to sit there being like very puzzled because you can't understand what I said. So the big picture, the world is changing. We all know that. I mean, I look at this audience and I'm delighted to see that there is a lot of young people in this audience. I've had the privilege of spending my career in a university environment. And I'm going to tell you why I'm still in a university environment at 66 years of age is because young people energize you and they don't let you sit still. They don't let you just accept the status quo. And I must see myself as an agent of change. I've tried to spend much of my career helping move things forward. And I think young people help you stay honest in doing that. So why is the world changing, though? The world that we have to live in. Globalization, we hear a lot about globalization, and we know that that has fostered many positives. There's a lot more international exchange than when I was young, but we still have this paradox of while there's more priority, more equality in some ways, we also see that globalization can actually create more disparities. It's not a solution to everything. It comes with some risks. And it's like the economic factors. There's been a huge amount of economic growth. The overall quality of economic life on the planet today is much better than it was when I was the age of many of you here. But with that also comes not only greater expectations and new opportunities, it brings with it greater stress and challenges to mental health. And one of the best examples of that is China, another country that I've had the privilege of coming to know quite well. And if you look at the rate of youth suicide in China today compared to 20 years ago, it's dramatically higher. And that's because the pressures on young people to succeed, in particular economically, are much greater than they were before. We know about political turmoil. That's not new. The world has always had some political turmoil, but we live in an era where the world at large becomes aware of every piece of political turmoil that's happening in any corner of the world. And some of it has significant geopolitical consequences. Demographics is something that we should always be paying attention to in terms of a continually evolving world. We see in the global south tremendous still population growth. We have the baby boomer generation in the global north, meaning an increasingly aged society, proportionate to young people. And of course, you would have to be completely asleep and not pay attention to anything at all in the world if you weren't aware that migration at this moment in time has once again become a very significant factor. And one of the things that gets missed when you just listen to the news superficially, we tend to think of it as driven by political factors in the Middle East. What we overlook is that many of the people who are refugees presenting at the border in the Balkan states and who are trying to get into Northern Europe are people from countries where the issue is economic migration. They are not refugees in the classic sense, but because of the economic state of their country, they are trying to escape and they're putting themselves into this wave of other more political refugees. So it's a very complex phenomenon. Education and socialization of children and youth has, of course, been one of the biggest step forwards in the second half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, especially girls and young women. And we only need to look at who's here today, right, to recognize that. I can tell you, because I was there, when I was first at UNAM or at the University of Ottawa or any of the other places I've been, the gender difference was very, very different. The gender presence was very different than it is now. And of course, I'm the last person you should ever ask to talk about advances in technology. I will say I'm no longer the dinosaur I once was when it came to technology. My son is a very qualified IT person and he's taught me a lot. My daughter, by the way, is with the Montreal Police. So that's a very unconventional career in our country for a woman to pursue. Now, the world is changing, but so is psychology. And I'm going to start with the age-old question, what is psychology? Well, one of the things one learns if one works at the international level is how psychology is understood or defined has variable meanings in different countries and particularly different regions. It's not so much country specific as it is more regional. By regional, I mean multinational. So we can look at more of a Latin American perspective, even though that will come with what is distinctly Mexican, distinctly Chilean, distinctly Colombian. But there is a way at a synthesis level we can see that there are trends that cover many parts of Latin America that create some commonalities that are not necessarily the same as what you would find in Spain, in Europe, because Spain is also a European country and reflects the European orientation. I don't know if you experience that, but I certainly do. When I've been in Spain, it is not the same thing as being in Mexico or being in another part of Latin America. And of course, because we are such a rich profession, a rich science, we have these tensions between basic and applied, between the biological bases of our understanding of human functioning and that which we get when we switch our focus to clinical health or social science. One of the things that I suggest to you, that if you've not been reading much about this or talking much about this, that it would be wise, and I'm especially speaking to those of you who are still students and young faculty to be paying attention to, is the emergence of epigenetics. For a long time, the belief system in the natural science world is that genetics was essentially a natural science phenomenon. We're learning an awful lot, and we're still just at the very beginning of it, that behavior shapes genetics, shapes genetic makeup, and it doesn't take, as in the Darwinian sense, 200 years for it to see impact. We're seeing impact in relatively short periods of time, 1 or 2 generations, in terms of some of the work that's going on now. This is tremendously important, and it's a phenomenal validation of why psychology, in my opinion, is the central intellectual discipline for the planet. You cannot make sense of where this planet needs to go in terms of sustainable development and a healthy future without psychology being at the core of it. And then, of course, we've got our always age-old, are we going to be more focused on theory development? We're going to let our knowledge base tell us what the theories ought to be, or we're theory-driven. We're going to go out and find the evidence that tells us that the theory is right. And it's another of our dynamics. So I want to just say something about my perspective on psychological science. I try not to quote myself very often, but I like this particular statement that Rainer Silber and I put together for the introduction of our book that we co-edited on psychology, education, and training around the world. And it's a reminder that what we really are as a science, and that we're not just about single cases. We're about careful generalizations. And the work that Dr. Reed is doing in diagnostic classification and differential diagnosis is a phenomenal example of that. In the case of psychology, what we're trying to get at is that dynamic interaction between individuals and environment. It's not either or, it's both. And society and cultures are particular expressions of environment. And they're not only diverse, that's true. You again, could not escape that conclusion, even with a very limited understanding. But what really becomes important for us, I think, as psychologists and how we contribute to the world in the context of society, culture, environment, is how change occurs over time, whether that be short periods of time or longer periods of time. So generalizations are limited, that's always true. And principles, mechanisms, and Western paradigms may apply to most or to only a few. One of the things that we are coming to better understand is that it's not a simple, global north, global south dynamic. There are commonalities, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the discipline that we are part of does vary greatly across countries, cultures, and society. And so inevitably, whether we like it or not, psychology as a science, psychology as an applied profession, has to address diversity. Okay, now just imagine up there in the top corner, that Canadian flag. So now you see the Canadian flag right here. Now I'm putting my Canadian hat on. I'm going to step out of my international role for a few minutes. And I'm going to tell you about something that Dr. Sanchez-Souza knows a lot about, as well as some Mexican colleagues, because we worked on some of this together from individual national perspectives, but we were sharing how we were developing as we went along. And if you don't know much about Canada, one of the things that's important to understand about Canada is that we are the second largest geographical landmass in the world, the second largest country physically. But we have a relatively small population. Our population is only approaching 40 million. So we're spread all across a very large landmass. As a result of that, we've developed a way of governing ourselves that is very decentralized. Okay? What you call states, we call provinces, have a huge amount of power in Canada. And so in Canada, it has been the case that it was often easier to accomplish things north-south or with other parts of the world than it was across the country. Okay? In the area of commodities, which is where free trade began before it started talking about people and services, literally, this is true. It was easier to import beer from Germany or chickens from the United States or beef from Argentina than it was to send beer across Canada, literally. So we developed in Canada something called the Agreement on Internal Trade. We called it the domestic NAFTA because NAFTA came first, believe it or not. And then people looked around and said, well, that's great. We've made it easier to get things accomplished with Mexico and the United States, but we've done anything to make it easier within our own country to move people around or to move services around or to move commodities around. And so what was new in the area of trade agreements, either domestically or more likely internationally, is we started talking about services and professional services, and in our case, health services especially, became part of what was adopted in this framework. And we had a regulatory system where each province regulates psychology. There is no national psychology law. There are 13 different psychology laws in Canada for each of the provinces and territories. And so we had to find, and the barriers were there too. So we had to find a way. We were told by governments, you don't have a choice. If you don't fix it yourself, if you don't find a way to make it possible, we will impose it on you. And we will give you 5 years to do it, which was not a bad amount of time. So I had the privilege of serving on the 10-person group that brought this into being. And what we determined in that process is that the best way to approach this was to put aside some of the traditional ways of thinking and to look at competencies. What is it that a psychologist should be able to do to be a competent, qualified psychologist, whether you're in the eastern part of the country, the northern part of the country, or the western part of the country? Regardless of where you are as a Canadian, you should be entitled to basically the same quality of psychological services based on competent providers. And so that's where we came up with this. And we came up with a set of what we call the core competencies. And that's what you see here: interpersonal relationships, assessment and diagnosis, intervention and consultation, research, and I'm going to come back and talk just a little bit about research in a minute, ethics and standards. And then, because this is Canada, we can never get perfect consensus on anything in Canada. So we always allow a little escape room, a little backdoor stuff, and say, well, everybody has to agree on this, right? Everybody has to do this. But if you want more, that's okay. You have to do the core 5. So in 2 provinces, supervision is actually a core competence. That's in Quebec and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And then in Quebec, they said no. Intervention, which is typically thought of as more classic clinical intervention, is not the same thing as consultation. We want that to be a competence that stands alone so it can get full attention. So for each competency, the competency has to be defined. There's a set of required knowledge that a student has to learn and master. And then there are skills to be attained. So obviously you see that this is all designed to produce what we call practitioners, people who will work as clinical psychologists, clinical health psychologists, educational psychologists, but it could also be organizational psychologists. It's not limited to one dimension, although in Canada, like in most countries, when you talk about the profession, it is overwhelmingly clinical and clinical health. These are by far the great majority of practitioners. So across the competencies, there's required foundational knowledge. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And as I just noted, it applies to all areas of psychological practice. Within our regulatory framework, we are regulated predominantly as a health profession. So part of what we had to do here is demonstrate that we are indeed a broad health profession, not a narrowly mental health profession. Mental health, of course, is a key component of this, but we are also fundamentally engaged in providing services all the way from primary care at the most basic community level to the most highly specialized care as you'd get in the case of a neuropsychologist. We face lots of continuing challenges. Don't think that this has all been accomplished just because we got it mapped out. Because of what I said about Canada and the nature of Canada, we're living in a very decentralized federation. The fact that everybody agreed to this doesn't mean that they're applying it the same way. So an example is that not everybody interprets the definition of the competencies the same way, or exactly how that knowledge gets lived out in a curriculum, because this doesn't lay out a full curriculum. And what are the specific skill sets? So there's still lots of work that we have to do to refine this. But I would suggest to you that for us, as well as for anybody who embarks on a competency orientation, the biggest challenge by far is how do you measure competency attainment? Even if you can agree on all these definitions, even if you can agree on what the knowledge is and the skills are, how do you measure it? How do you measure it in a way that is accurate, that is fair, so that the feedback that a student gets about their performance is accurate and both in a quantitative and a qualitative sense, taking them in the right direction? And then there's the issue of enforcing the agreement. What do you do? We have one province, which I won't name, which is an outlier, which basically agreed to this, signed off on it, and basically chooses to ignore it. Okay, so how are we going to enforce that? I mentioned that we brought it about by having a work group, and we started to have this immediate debate, because at that time in Canada, you still had some master's level entry provinces and some doctoral entry provinces. And that was a fundamental historic barrier to agreeing on anything related to mobility. And we've seen that with other countries as well. And we said, okay, could we come up with a mechanism where we don't start the discussion by talking about what the terminal degree is? Why don't we talk about what it takes to get there? And what's a reasonable amount of time that it takes to accomplish that? Now, in the way our educational system is set up, to do all the things that this competency-based framework requires you to do, it is the length of time that it takes in Canada to go from starting our bachelor's degree, which is not exactly the same as the bachelor's degree in Mexico, to completing a doctoral degree. So it is, for all practical purposes, in a functional sense, a doctoral standard. It's just we chose not to label it that way. And what we did is we had to get the buy-in, the agreement of all the key constituencies, the educators, right? None of this was going to happen if the educators said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to educate people to do these things. We don't agree with it. Practitioners had to agree that this is what it made sense to be trained to do. The professional associations had to agree to lobby their governments to bring this into force. And credentialing bodies and regulators had to be willing then to regulate it and provide credentials around it. At the end of the day, though, it's like everything else I've ever been involved with, locally, meaning at the university, or at the biggest international level, without goodwill and trust, forget it. You're not going anywhere. So you've got to create a process that allows people to begin to trust each other and where you can tolerate differences. Some good news here from our point of view. In our country, the National Association, the Canadian Psychological Association, is responsible for accreditation. And the accreditation standards have been modified to map generally very well onto the regulatory-based competency requirements. And so, as a result, accredited academic and internship programs have mostly adapted their delivery of education and training to the current regulatory requirements. We have very, very few outliers there. I mentioned we have one province that's an outlier, but really basically in terms of how our education system operates, and the great majority of people who move into practice come out of accredited programs, which isn't true in all countries, I understand, but it is in our case. So getting that to be adjusted to meet the new system was a very critical stage. So the shift in emphasis in accreditation that accompanied this is a shift in emphasis toward outcomes. We want standards that increase the probability that the competencies are actually attained. It's not just whether you can say on a checklist, we do these things. You actually produce people who actually can deliver these competencies to people in need. The competencies I noted are based on the MRA and the accreditations. Now, this is where there's a difference between the regulatory framework, which doesn't presume a doctoral degree, and the accreditation standards, which do. Accreditation standards are based on a doctoral degree requirement. There is still some of this checklist stuff, but the more important part are the defined accountabilities for academic programs and internships. Because in accreditation, who you hold accountable is not the student. You hold the programs accountable for being able to demonstrate that they deliver what they say they're supposed to deliver. So I mentioned earlier that there were foundational areas, and I just didn't want to leave this without noting that these are pretty conventional. There's nothing very radical about this. It's the stuff that's been around a long time. It's the biological basis of behavior, cognitive basis of behavior, social basis of behavior, and psychology of the individual. I have included in the slides, but which you can be very thankful we're not going to walk through in great detail, because for the purpose of this kind of talk, it would put anybody to sleep, even if I was speaking in Spanish, is to go through all of the micro components. So anybody who wants the PowerPoint, I will ask Dr. Sanchez Souza to tell you. I mean, you can email me, but it's already here in the system. They can deliver it to you. And so for those who are interested in this kind of stuff, I did want to provide that amount of detail in the PowerPoint for those of you who might want to look at the PowerPoint for some other purpose later. But I'll just note here in assessment and evaluation that it's got all of the usual stuff, but it also blends human development, not as a standalone fundamental area of knowledge, but as something that is crucial to being able to deliver and perform good assessment, good psychological assessment, do good psychological evaluation, and of course diagnosis, which in our country has been a very big issue. It's one of our biggest accomplishments in the last quarter century, is to get psychologists recognized as being able to do formal differential diagnosis. So I'm just going to move. I want to just move to the research one, because the research one is one where it's important to understand what we mean by research. You would say, if you're training practitioners, why would you have a research competence? Right? Why wouldn't you just leave that for people who are doing the research type PhD, or who want to do the more classic scientist practitioner kind of training? But this was one of the big debates, and this is one of the places where I feel that there was a lot of shifting that went on. There were maybe 3 of us at the start out of the 10 who thought that research was important to have as a competence, and in the end, all 10 agreed. Because we define research as both basic knowledge of research methods, but it's also the applications of scientific research. And that included being able to apply research approaches to social systems. We wanted people, because in Canada at least, psychologists are known as the only health profession that knows anything about research in a broad and deep way. And so a lot of what happens in real life is not the kind of scholarly research that gets into journals or that writes books, but it's the kind of thing that helps programs look at whether they're succeeding in delivering their programs effectively. So it's around issues of efficacy, efficiency, outcomes. And so the skills that you're expected to require in this context are of that nature. It's not the traditional development of original new knowledge, as though you were going to be a long-time scientist as the driver of your career. Okay, so I'm just going to move in the interest of time. Whoops. For those of you who are interested in supervision, you might want to look at the supervision one, because even though it's not part of the core, because it is in 2 of the provinces, and it's something that everybody has to do in some fashion or another, the debate was, is it enough to require it as a distinct competence? And obviously at the political level, those of us who promoted this supervision as a core competence lost. But because at the time I was also chairing the committee that developed the standards in Quebec, we got it into Quebec. We didn't get it anywhere except in Newfoundland. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the survey. Again, for those of you who are interested in it, there's a whole chapter on the book that Silbereisen and I did with Janet Camdy on the survey, so it's described in more detail there. But it is noteworthy that we wanted to find out at the level of the International Union of Psychological Science, which, as Dr. Sanchez-Souza noted in his kind introduction, is the UN body for psychology in the world. It is a national member base, and so we have this great pool of people and organizations that we can tie into to determine when it's possible to get information on a collective basis where we stand. And so what we use, the key part here is we used a key person methodology. We didn't try to survey individuals across the countries. We went to key people in the countries, those who we felt were and the recommendations of the national associations were in a position to be knowledgeable about education and training, and asked them, what is the state of education and training in your country, related to a certain number of questions that we asked them to do. So if we had a talk just on the survey, I would go into a lot of detail on these tables and graphs that the chapter developed. But what's very clear is that you get into psychology in most places through a combination of things. The highest one only accounts for 50%, right? It's some general education requirements. Other grades in some places are much more important, it turns out, than others. If you want to get any kind of advanced training in Japan, you've got to have very, very, very high grades. In other countries, you need to have just a good solid average, but not excellence. Some have national entrance exams to get into higher training in psychology. Some have university-specific entrance exams. It's interesting that only a few require foreign language abilities. In terms of, and it would take me 10 minutes to explain what is a level 1, level 2, level 3, a uniform program, and a doctoral program, so I'm not going to do that. Let me just note that level 1 would be your most initial, whatever way you do that in a particular country, it's when people go to university. It's whatever the start of university education is that would then bring you into psychology. But in some countries, level 1 is 1 or 2 years of general education with no psychology, and then they go into a level 2. Level 3 is reasonably equivalent to master's. Uniform programs are those that provide a continuous flow. Basically says, if we admit you, certainly at level 2, not necessarily at level 1, but at level 2, and you continue to perform satisfactorily, you don't have to apply to be readmitted. You're guaranteed to go all the way. So if they stop at the master's, they go to the master's. If they go to the doctoral, they go all the way to the doctoral. But what you saw there, again, is a huge amount of variability across countries. The average number of students per country in different kinds of programs also varied considerably. These numbers, of course, are skewed by the larger countries. Right? So as soon as you have the United States and some of the bigger European countries participating in a survey like this, you end up with means that are off the wall. But it's not just from those countries, it's from others. And so the fact that you have such a large number at level 1 is really a reflection of the more international context. When you look at uniform and doctoral, that's much more driven by the countries we would usually associate with that. The degree of specialization. When does specialization begin to occur? Also is very, very different. It was a surprise to some of us to see that even at level 1, in many countries, there was already a shift toward specialization rather than a broad-based development of competencies, or what I would construe as competencies. So a level 3 programs in most countries actually represented masters as the ultimate, that was the level 3, with 2 lowers, that is a level 1 component and a level 2 component. That's the most common. But within those kinds of programs, 82% of their focus was on the development of specialization rather than broad-based. And I won't go through the rest of that because that is less significant. The doctoral level, again, when you come from a country like Canada, where we have two very distinct kinds of doctoral programs. We have doctoral programs that are designed to produce practitioners, and we have doctoral programs that are designed to produce scientists. But in most places, the reality is that it's research only, which I think is largely the case here in Mexico. Certainly, I believe at UNAM that's the case. Is that not correct? Yes, for a doctoral. And only 17% worldwide are dominantly applied oriented. And then there's the 25% where it can be either or both. But in only 39% of countries where there are doctoral degrees offered, is the doctoral degree required for independent practice of psychology. So even where you have doctoral degrees at maybe the master's level, typically, or even in some cases below the master's, that will actually get you qualified to be a practicing psychologist. So I'm going to just skip by this and go to the next stage. All right. So the good news is I didn't stay too long on all those slides with all of that detail crowded into the slide. If you want to read more about that, you can get the PowerPoint. If you really want to know more about it, get access to the chapter in the book that lays it all out in great detail. But for those of us who have been working on this, and you probably picked up from the introduction, although he's always very articulate, he's always very elegant, he always treats everybody very well. But Dr. Sanchez-Souza and I go back a long ways. We've known each other for a very long time. And we've been working on these issues for a long time. Sometimes just bilaterally, Mexico and Canadian colleagues getting together, sometimes trilaterally, and sometimes at the larger international level. We've been in all parts of it. And he knows very well. And those of you who might have experienced this yourself, and I don't want to assume that you haven't, certainly Dr. Reed has had the opportunity to experience some of this in some ways. The fact that you are a psychologist doesn't mean that you talk the same language, even if you all understand English. Which, whether we like it or not, is the international language at this point. I'm afraid that just is the case. But can we make any sense of it? Well, we start with, yes, there is a high degree of variability, and it is difficult to arrive at a common understanding. Academic, scientific, research-oriented psychology is much more likely to have an international perspective. When a bunch of scientists get together who all work on the same stuff, it doesn't matter so much whether one's in Russia, another's in Japan, another's in South Africa, one's in Mexico, and somebody's from somewhere else. Let's say Canada. I'll just be parochial for a minute. They much more likely to have a quick, ready ability to understand each other. They may not agree on everything, but they know what they're talking about. Concepts are similar. They're familiar with the same research base, and they can move forward together, even in a debate context, more easily. Professional psychology is much more likely to be driven by national characteristics. I'm going to suggest that for us as a profession, it is valuable ultimately to the people we are trying to serve to develop more of an international framework. And it would enhance our capacity to move psychology forward in those countries where psychology is very underdeveloped. I mean, here in Mexico, me in Canada, we all, as psychologists, live in very privileged environments. And I'm not talking about whether we're personally rich or personally poor by background. I'm talking about as psychologists, we're in privileged environments. I can tell you from being there, that's not the case in most of sub-Saharan Africa. It's not the case in most of the Middle East. It's not the case in many parts of Asia. And I dare say it's not true in every part of Latin America either. So in order for psychology to move ahead, for psychology to get the recognition and the legitimacy that it needs to have, and ultimately that means funding and providing opportunities for young people like yourselves in other parts of the world to get trained in psychology, to get educated in psychology, we have to get psychology recognized. When you can come with an international framework that a country then has in its own psychology community said we want to be part of. And in order for us to be part of that, we have to move ourselves up. That's a much more powerful argument to make to a national government than it is just to go as a national association. If you go with the support of international colleagues, not because they're trying to tell you what to do, not because they're trying to impose a model on you that doesn't reflect your own cultural traditions, because these are not mutually exclusive, but having a core common framework can be a huge tool to moving everybody forward. And I'm of the old-fashioned belief, the old-fashioned idea that when one group, one country gets to move ahead, everybody is better off for it. The whole world is moving in the right direction. It will have ripple effects that are positive, way beyond the local context. I'm coming back now to linking in globalization. And one of the things that we have found in the last decade and a half, 15 years, not more than 20, is the development of the term I use is new regionalism. There is a very complex relationship between globalization across as an international, global, the whole planet kind of phenomenon, and regionalization. Because this doesn't just happen at the level of the whole planet. There are very complex patterns of interactions and reactions at the local, national, regional, and global levels. And if we look at where the greatest step forward has been in globalization, it's actually at the regional level. You have an Asian free trade agreement. You have an African free trade agreement. You have a European free trade agreement. You have one that covers part of Latin America. You have the trilateral in Canada, United States, and Mexico in NAFTA. And there's even one that is sub-regional to some degree, because Asia is so big that there's one for South Asia. And all of this then drives certain phenomena that occur not so much internationally at the global level, but internationally at the multinational level within these continental or subcontinental regions. I mean, certainly that's where we began. So when we're talking about globalization, there are some things that we can sort of see as trends or basics. And one of those is that basic theoretical psychology is considered foundational. That the great buy-in that psychological practice should be science informed. It is not really a debate. If you look at all of the member countries of IUCIS, there is no debate about whether the profession of psychology should be science-based, science-informed. Some may say the research component should be stronger as part of that training, and others may say, no, the way we've defined it in Canada is quite sufficient. It's enough to be a sophisticated consumer of research and a sophisticated, on-the-ground, applied scientist without wearing the capital S science as your career path or your identity. How these elements are understood and operationalized in the global south is much more variable, except for the science-informed one, as I noted. Historic Western intellectual domination in psychology is still a continuing confound. And one of the things that some of the work we did in IUCIS in recent years around education and training actually helped demythologize that a bit. It's less true than one might have thought that every element of Western intellectual tradition is in contradiction to a more indigenous framework. It is in some cases, but not as many as you might think. And everywhere, you've got to pay attention to national and regional differences. And that's where I come back to the notion of diversity. That's where I come back to the cultural base. If you don't acknowledge the legitimacy of that, the importance of that right up front, you're missing a very big part of the picture. And it's absolutely important to move forward an international agenda. And it may seem contradictory. You have to recognize national and regional in order to move forward internationally. But in my experience, in my opinion, it's absolutely true. So, finding a way forward. Well, you probably know already, and that's why I wanted you to know the Canadian stuff right from the beginning. There's no question my Canadian experience informs this, but I'm going to say in my own defense, a very big part of my international experience informs this as well. Competence, a competency-oriented framework is our best hope for moving forward internationally. It enables us to put aside those traditional barriers between basic and applied, between masters and doctoral. It's not that these things are trivial, it's not that they're unimportant, but it shouldn't be the only thing that determines how we debate. And what we've learned from those debates is it doesn't move us very far forward. It doesn't enable a lot of change to occur. So if we want change to occur, if we want something to actually be better and different, that responds to what society has a reasonable right to expect of us, then the competence framework is a much better approach to go. So this is beyond the Tower of Babel. A framework for education and training from an international framework would define the discipline, it would enhance mobility, it would provide minimal standards, not maximum standards. What we're talking about here is what is good enough, not necessarily what is the best, but what is excellent, but what is good enough. Now that's already a lot. If you remember how those even though we didn't go into a lot of detail about the specifics, if you look at how all those core competencies were laid out, even though we define that as core, minimal, I would argue that that's quite a bit. It takes a lot of work for students to accomplish that. It takes a lot of work for those of us who are educators to help you accomplish that. But it also provides aspirational standards. So we would have the minimal part, but it also says we can strive for even more, but without imposing the higher standards on everybody. So finding what we can agree on is important if we keep in mind differences in demographics. What are the population characteristics of a given country or a given world? What is the level of development in that country? And differences in context, cultural and geographic. So confirming a common definition of what psychology is and establishing its scope is key to all of this. We have to get that definition out there. We have to understand what we think we mean by what psychology is and what being a psychologist represents in order to get there. It's not just enough to take the old idea of let 1,000 flowers bloom. It may be nice to have 1,000 flowers blooming, but we got to have some commonality in there if we're going to move forward. So that means, in my view, again, this will not be a surprise if you've been able to follow at all what I've been saying so far, is that we're going to identify core principles and competencies. It's going to be general enough that it allows local organizations to apply it to their specific needs and the conditions of their country. And it's going to require outreach, resources, consensus building, leadership, and infrastructure development. And this one I always include because it's so easy for us to ignore that. It's not that building buildings and providing money and hiring people is in and of itself going to get the job done. But if you don't do it, none of the rest of this is going to happen. So there are a number of things that are happening internationally. And I'm again going to do like I did with the core competencies in Canada. I'm just going to outline this quickly. There are more slides here than I'm going to actually talk about. But for those of you who'd be interested more in this aspect of it, there are some more slides here that if you want to take a look at it at another time, you'll be able to do. So one of the things that's happening right now is this international project on competence in psychology that is sponsored by the International Union of Psychological Science, the International Association of Applied Psychology, and it does have substantial support from the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards that links Canada and the United States at the regulatory level of psychology. And the goal, what it's about, is to promote the development of a global agreement on identifying the benchmark competencies that identify professional psychology. It captures a good part of what I've been talking about in other ways. And what they're doing in that project is looking at how to establish the list of competencies, a description of the competencies, and the structure of the model. So it's not intended at this stage to go as far as we did in the Canadian context, but it's a good part of the way there, but now within an international framework. And some of the concepts that it uses, again, if you've seen the rest, some of the terminology is different, but it's just differences in terminology. So it talks about knowledge and skills. We've been talking about that already. talks about though professional behavior, talks about how psychologists behave and how competencies are related to the way in which they work. And it talks about activities, what they do, or the activities that they undertake in their work. So it's a different way of organizing it, but it's not dramatically different. It's not contradictory to what some of the other things are that we've looked at already. So, and again, I will just simply note as an example, when we talk about professional behavior, that's where they link in ethics rather than necessarily make it distinct. It talks about being able to practice ethically, act professionally, relate to clients or patients and others, and work with individual and cultural diversity. So I'm just going to now move to another example that again, there's a whole book that came out on this last year. Yippie Fortinga, Ingrid Lunt, and I can't remember who the other authors are. Anybody remember who the other authors are? Jeff or Jose? Yes. Severi Nielsen, right. So there's a whole book on that, on the EuroPsy. EuroPsy is a credential that has been developed for psychologists in Europe that is designed within the European Union to enable psychologists to go from one country to another. Within the European Union, in principle, anybody is supposed to be able to go to any other country and be able to work. At the level of professions, concerns were expressed about that because there was a recognition that the standards across the European countries were quite different. You had some that saw themselves as very high. You had others that recognized they weren't so high, but they thought it was adequate. And they thought, well, why shouldn't a psychologist from country X, where they don't have to do as much to become a psychologist, not be able to go to a country like the United Kingdom or Germany and be able to practice there if they want to? And basically the profession started to push back on the EU and said, no, we need to develop some mechanisms to ensure a minimum standard. And so that's why the European Union, through what it calls its Leonardo da Vinci program, provided money for psychology organizations to develop this credential called the EuroPsy that has been agreed upon by the psychology regulatory bodies where they exist, or associations if they don't, across 35 countries. But it took them 10 years to do it. So that just tells me that Europe's even more complicated than Canada is. We did it in 5. But I understand when you've got 35 countries, that's more than 13 provinces and territories. And they got more languages too. So I won't, in the interest of time, go into detail on the EuroPsy, but I put into the slides this kind of information that might be of interest to you if you wanted to look at that. And I'm just going to get right to the end of that. All right. So now this is the concluding part. If you remember the roadmap, I said we would end with some observations. So although I tried to be as honest as I could up front and saying, yes, I come with some biases out of my experience and my background, but now this is the part where it's clearly my opinions. And all I'm saying is the context for it is now not so much my Canadian background as more than a quarter century of working at the international level. And we're going to start with the high variability in basic and advanced education and training in applied psychology. I mean, it is just really tremendously variable. The development of international standards for psychology education and training is really just beginning. Not at the national level, although in many cases it's absent altogether at the national level, not in places like Canada and Mexico, obviously. But when it comes to international standards, we're still at the very beginning. With very few exceptions, there is little that is substantially similar to an accredited program, accredited doctoral program by either the American Psychological Association or the Canadian Psychological Association in other countries. I think that it is still a useful model for how to organize accreditation, but whether all of the specifics of our accreditation system are appropriate to every other part of the world, I think is an open question. I think how do I say this diplomatically? There's no way to say this diplomatically. Our American colleagues have a great deal of trouble with this. There is a presumption, even among the most liberal, well-intentioned American psychologists, again, with very few exceptions. Our colleague Mary Bullock would be a very good example of that. The director of international affairs at APA is someone who doesn't think like this. But there is this general belief, and it's if we know as psychologists about belief systems. There is this implicit belief that because the United States has put such a huge amount of effort into this, such a huge amount of resources into it, and developed it to such a large degree, that of course it must be right for everybody else. Well, I can tell you from Canada, which is a lot more similar to the United States than most parts of the world, even in Canada, it's not true. That's why we developed our own accreditation system. It's why you're doing the same thing in Mexico. And we all share the same continent, right? What I was saying earlier about the regional trend. And I see Dr. Sanchez Souza smiling because he and I can remember the same meetings. It was actually kind of fun because the Mexicans, what the Americans didn't expect, they didn't see it coming, was that the Canadians and the Mexicans were going to group together and they were going to be outnumbered. And it was you want to talk about, now in fairness, right? Cultural shock is not just the property of other parts of the world. Americans can experience cultural shock too. And it was a real eye-opener. And to the credit of many of our American colleagues, those who stayed with us over a period of several years eventually came to start thinking and seeing things differently. And they became great ambassadors for a new way of thinking. Now, they're still a minority, but the reality that we have to work with, I think, so when I go around the world as a Canadian, I don't apologize for being a Canadian. I don't apologize to you for putting up front in my talk what we did in Canada. I think you should know that because it helps you understand who I am. But I hope I didn't do it in a way that said, this is the only way to go. I think some of those concepts have great merit. I think when you look at what psychologists are expected to do around the world, they are expected to assess and diagnose. They are expected to treat. They are expected to behave ethically. And we know that the interpersonal competence is a core in psychology. So that's where I think that we have a framework that works very well, but not necessarily in all the specificities. I think that a competency-based framework, this is my bias, obviously, offers the greatest promise for education and training that facilitates commonality and international mobility. And I want to repeat again, because I don't think it's always well enough understood, that there's strong endorsement of psychology as a science-based, science-informed profession across the world. The continuing debate is about what kind of research expertise is required for practitioners. And that's very different than that first statement. And the first statement is the much more important one. There is an increasing recognition around the world that psychology should be thought of as a very broad-based health profession and not simply within a classic mental health model. Of course, that is part of our own core, it's part of our own tradition. But what we're doing in the area of primary care and specialized clinical health psychology care is as important today as a classic mental health approach to who we are. And I'm just going to again say the competency-based framework, that's my mantra, is the way I recommend that we go. And I'm happy to debate other alternatives. As is always the case when anybody gives a talk like this, it's not just about what they did. I'm happy and proud, in fact, to say I helped make some of this happen, but it's always been in conjunction with other people. Phil Grandia, who just graduated with his PhD a few months ago, actually last month, was my research assistant for a long time. He worked with me on a lot of this stuff. And so I want to give Phil credit because he's a part of all of what I've presented here. And some colleagues like Judy Hall, Laura Hernandez Guzman, Ingrid Lunt, Rainer Silbereisen, Juan Jose Sanchez Souza, have spent literally hundreds of hours one-on-one in groups, and this has enriched me tremendously. Anything that I reflect here today shouldn't be blamed on them, but anything that you like about it, you should say they're part of that. They're part of what helped make that happen. And literally many other people, dozens of colleagues from around the globe have given me lots of opportunity for a vigorous debate. I love debates and stimulating intellectual exchange. So I again want to thank UNAM and the Faculty of Psychology for inviting me here. It's been a privilege to be back in your environment and to have this opportunity to share this thinking with you. And I look forward to any exchange or discussion we might have in the next while. Sí, sí. Congratulations. That is a huge question, and a very, very good question and a hard question all at the same time. Okay, sorry about that. I'll stand over here. When I teach, I usually sit on the desk. I take my jacket off and I sit on the desk. That's the way I like to teach, and just use the clicker as I need to. First of all, I want to reinforce your perspective. Back in my university, I'm responsible for clinical training in our university. I mean, in psychology, in the School of Psychology, not for all disciplines, just psychologists. One of the things that I'm trying to do in this very latter stage of my career is prompt my colleagues, encourage my colleagues to be thinking about where is our profession going? We should be training people for where we're heading, not for what we were good at 10 years ago. And it's really tough. University environments come with this great contradiction in most places of the world. I'm not assuming that's necessarily the case at UNAM. I don't know enough about UNAM to presume that, but I can simply say, from having been around a lot of universities in different contexts in the academic world, in some of the roles that I've played, I've been struck ever since I was a student with, on the one hand, universities have this fundamental mission to be agents of change, to bring forth new knowledge. Universities themselves are the most resistant to change among the many institutions of our society. You know, universities tend to get quite encrusted in the way they are. So it's really a contradiction. How do you manage this process? Well, I think it's best managed at the unit level. So within a faculty of psychology or within any other unit of university, you can get colleagues who would agree that what we should be doing is looking to the future. Yes, we are, of course. I mean, my original training, my original intellectual training was as a historian. I didn't come into psychology the conventional way. I was working on a PhD in history before I went into psychology. And I still see myself as very historically minded. So when I make a comment that we shouldn't be working to get toward what was good in the past, that doesn't mean I think we should ignore the past. I think we should always be informed by what we've done in the past, as long as it's taking us forward and not just leading us to stagnate. Now, my personal opinion, I think, was captured to a good degree in the talk. If you're asking me my opinion about where I think the future is headed, big picture wise. I think as an applied profession, our ticket to the future is by being seen and performing as a broad-based health profession, but within a very broad scope of practice, where not any one practitioner can do all the things in that scope of practice, and where there are certain key pieces simply because of their historic significance as well as their functional significance. So the capacity to do diagnosis, I think, is a really important one. But having said that, I wouldn't want to overemphasize it. I would want to come back to this bigger health psychology. And no, sorry, I don't want to put it that way. Psychology as a health profession. Health psychology as a domain of psychology is a subsector. I tend to prefer to think of it as clinical health psychology. It marries the best elements of traditional clinical psychology and the best elements of health psychology into a new wave. I think the other thing that we have to do, and this is where I believe the global north and the global south meet up. It is not, in my opinion, what I'm about to say now, just a global south phenomenon. And that is, we need to have psychologists in the part of the world I come from. We call it primary care. We call it community-based care. And what that means is that we have to be willing to recognize that within primary care, we will not be the people who do all of the clinical work. That a part of what we do will be clinical work, and it will be with the hardest people to serve, because that's where you should have the highest order skill sets, not with the people who are relatively easy to diagnose and treat. It should be the ones who are harder. There are going to be other providers who can provide certain core services quite effectively, insofar as they have access to other resources in their immediate environment, which means that psychologists will also then have to be prepared to serve as consultants to other providers, so that the life of a clinical health psychologist would be a blend of clinical work and consultation work. And that can be done very effectively at the local level, because it means you have a vehicle to expand the number of providers. You can't just train people at the highest level, even in the most advanced countries. It is not rational, and it's not economically sustainable, even in the most advanced countries. So if you're going to look at it from the point of view of countries, one of the things I'm working on at WHO right now is something called the MH gap, the mental health gap, where we're looking at the disparity between demonstrated need for very broadly construed mental health, psychological health intervention, and the capacity to deliver it. In many parts of the world, you are lucky if you reach 5 to 10% of the people in need. That means 90 to 95%. In other cases, it's as good as 20%. But even in the global north, even in my own country, we're only currently resourced to meet about 65 to 70% of the need. And we're among the most affluent countries in the world. So we've clearly got to come up with some other mechanisms. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it gives you a snapshot at a very practical level. Buenas tardes. With the other mental health professions? Yeah. I'll move back here. Another excellent set of comments, right? Now, I'm going to say right up front, I think you're right. I think your observations are not unique to Mexico. And I think there is a way forward on this. And I'll come back to the competency-based framework for a moment. If you remember, when I presented the Canadian approach, and I talked about in the core competencies, we defined one of the competencies as intervention and consultation. Now, we have one province, Quebec, which said consultation is so important in itself, we should make it a competency of its own. But either way, you have to address consultation. And a lot of what consultation is about is exactly what you were describing. So I'll give you two examples. About 8 months ago, I was asked to come and talk to the psychologists in one of our largest hospitals in Ottawa. Now, Ottawa is our national capital, but it's not, by the standards of Mexico City, it's not a big place. We're about taking the biggest metropolitan region you can imagine to include Ottawa. We're still only just barely 1 million people. That's a long way from being 20 million here in Mexico City. So when I say we got 25 psychologists working in one of our largest hospitals, that may seem to you like a very small number. But for us, that's a pretty big group of people. And they asked if I would come and meet with them because they felt they weren't getting the recognition they needed in their hospital. And could I come and help them think about that? But that was I felt very honored to be invited to come out and talk to them about that. And so we spent the first part of the time, and I just asked a bunch of questions, largely about, well, what are you doing? What's happening in this hospital? What are you doing? What are your activities? And basically what came out of it was that they were doing a huge amount of clinical work. There's no question about that. And I have not the slightest doubt that it was being done at a very good level, from a quality point of view. It was being provided competently. I had no reason to think that was any part of the issue at all. But they felt that that within the hospital, some things that they felt should be happening with their patients weren't. They weren't being, when they would make recommendations, they weren't being picked up on, or they weren't being listened to. So I asked them to describe what an average day and an average week was like. I turned the question around a bit. I said, break it down for me, like percentage-wise. So, they talked about how much time they spent with patients, how much time they spent writing reports or progress notes or chart notes or whatever, and a few other administrative things. And I said, well, how much time do you spend with your colleagues? How much time do you spend with the nurses? How much time do you spend with the social workers? How much time do you spend with the physicians? And well, that was the teeniest fraction of all. So I gave them one recommendation. I said, spend more time outside of your offices, right? Even if you're not quite sure what you want to say to them, they'll ask you. You don't have to worry. They're going to have questions for you. Take the time to answer their questions. One of the things about 20 years ago that when I introduce myself, when I get the chance to introduce myself and I'm not introduced, like when I do it with a class, when I do it with my students, and I say, I want you to know how I see myself. I say, I see myself as a clinician, as a teacher, as a manager, and as a politician. Because a big part of my life, I've been a politician on behalf of this profession and this science. When you look at what I do in organizations, whether it's locally or internationally, part of me is functioning as a politician. And I mean, because I see politics still as a noble profession. It's not seen that way everywhere, I recognize. But let's face it, if you don't engage the political process in whatever system you find yourself, every system comes with a decision-making apparatus. Every system comes with a system of governance. UNAM has a system of governance. University of Ottawa has a system of governance. Countries have systems of governance. You have to engage it. And so as a politician, aside from the fact that I just started to be more honest and said that's who I am, I also developed a way of being a politician. And as a politician, what I came to understand quite a long time ago is if you don't understand how other people define what they need, you cannot succeed as a politician, unless it's in the crudest, crassest, worst ways of being a politician, which is just to get power to yourself and control other people. And that's not the kind of politics I'm interested in, personally. If somebody else wants to be a politician like that, they can go be a politician like that. That's not me. And in fairness, a lot of the real politicians that I've engaged in aren't like that either. Many of them really are genuinely interested in making a difference, but they don't have the tools to do it. They need, and so I say to your question, we have to hear what people, our colleagues, see as needing from us. And once they start to experience how they get benefit from it, not just the patients, how the way they can deliver services, how we can help organize services, then our standing, our credibility, our legitimacy starts to go up. And then, you know, about 15 years ago, the Minister of Health in Ontario decided that he wanted to reform primary care. So he said to each of the professional associations, you can name one person to a special committee I'm going to establish that is going to be given 3 months. So this time we didn't get 5 years, got 3 months. We will fund them to come to the capital and meet every week for a day for 3 months, and then come to me with some recommendations about primary care, how it should be delivered, who should be engaged in it. And the greatest part of that exercise was that the other professions, most especially family physicians, they were the strongest voice, and the nurses made the best case for us. And my approach to it was always to kind of not make too bold statements. And so they would say, oh, no. You know, we need you even more than that. And so we got built in as a core provider in primary care, not just because we advocated for it, but because we were experienced. So when we had these discussions, and my contribution was simply responding to those discussions and saying, well, relative to that need or that issue or that problem, here's where I think we might be able to make a contribution to it. And then by the end of the day, the only profession other than nursing and medicine that everybody agreed had to be part of the core group were psychologists.
¿Algún último comentario chiquito? Sí.
Sí. Sí, sí, sí.
Just to be sure. Yeah, I got the big thrust of it. I want to get that all in the okay. Mexico, at UNAM, maybe not so much at UNAM, but in many other universities, we still have this very old tradition that your favorite theorist is going to guide whatever you do in life in terms of your profession. And what he's saying is we still have some of those, so that these traditions or currents of thought within psychology. And most of them are not precisely interested in research-based decisions. And the question was, would you say that it's pertinent or it's important to insist and teach them that this is needed? For instance, being research-based or research-informed.
So this is my opinion on another really, I mean, you guys are great at generating good questions. So here's my opinion on that one. It's not either or. I think that, and this is the historian part of me speaking now, I think it is important to pay attention to what our intellectual traditions are. So I think that students should learn in a fundamental way what are the main theories that have contributed to the development of psychology. I think that's part of what all psychologists should learn about, just as they should learn something about the history of psychology. And that's sometimes where we learn part of that. In others, it might be in a course like theories of personality. Having said that, that's not sufficient. It's just simply not sufficient. We have to be guided as part of our intellectual development by what both qualitative and quantitative research tells us. And it shouldn't just be the research that supported a particular theory. You've got to look at it across theories. Now, in the part of the world where I live, although in 2015, most practitioners, most psychologists practicing psychology in Canada would say that an important part of the theoretical framework that guides their work is cognitive behavior therapy, CBT. Only the smallest minority would say that's all they do. That's the only framework that they rely on. That most people are approaching what they do from an integrative perspective, where they're working with at least two different theoretical orientations, or what in some places is actually called a trans-theoretical model, where you get a good understanding of what the problem is, you know what the science-based information is that's most pertinent to that particular problem area, and you adapt your intervention accordingly. And I think you can practice competently depending on who your patient population is, depending on the problems you work on, very well from either. So although you might expect me, given some of the other things I've said, to kind of be a strong advocate for a trans-theoretical approach as what everybody should do, I think that it's just fine to have an integrative approach, which is based on a more limited number of frameworks. Did that answer your question, or at least address your question? Okay. Okay.
Antes de despedir al doctor Ritchie, queremos hacerle dos reconocimientos, pero antes también quiero decirles que quienes quieran la PowerPoint o quienes quieran el capítulo del libro lo conseguimos y se lo distribuimos, porque veo que en realidad en este momento estamos, quizá no en todo el país, pero por lo menos en la UNAM, en estas transiciones críticas en las que podemos tomar una decisión que nos facilite la vida en 10 o 20 años o que nos la haga más difícil. Entonces, déjenme presentarle al Dr. Ritchie two sets of recognitions. The first one is for this talk, of course, and that's one is given by the university. And the big one is the recognition for something that you have been doing. Es el reconocimiento por lo que ha estado haciendo durante casi 20 años, que es esto que él describía de haber hecho pandilla con la psicología mexicana desde el punto de vista canadiense. Es un reconocimiento que le hace la Sociedad Mexicana de Psicología por haber adoptado este papel internacional de apoyo en vez de decir, como él lo dijo en un momento, de que si en Estados Unidos decíamos somos los mejores, todos deberían copiarnos. Y ese es un gran logro del doctor Ritchie, y se lo damos en términos, a nombre del presidente de la Sociedad Mexicana de Psicología, que no pudo estar con nosotros.